Hey everybody, welcome to RotoCurve Live for Week 16, as always presented by RotoCurve.com. I'm your host, Josh Collacchi, here with my co-hosts, Ricky Sanders and Jim McCormick, and we're here to help you cash in Week 16 in NFL DFS. You may be noticing that Adam Pfeiffer is not with us today. Ricky is pinch hitting for him. We had to place Adam on the 15-day DL retroactive to last Tuesday, so we hope to see him back in January. But it's a good thing we got to call up Ricky from AAA. Unfortunately, we haven't added him to the 40-man roster yet because he's not worth that. But what we're going to do here is we're going to do each and every week on RC Live, we will talk about our favorite players and how we're going to approach the slate at hand. So without further ado, let's just dive right into it. Quarterbacks for Week 16 in NFL DFS. Ricky, we'll start with you.
All right, so it's a weird week, and I play a lot of fantasy draft, so I have a lot of focus on the Sunday slate where other people don't, and I think that's what led to the low ownership of Ben Roethlisberger on the Thursday night slate. To be honest with you, I was really surprised to see him at 5% ownership. I know Jim and I talked about him earlier in the week, where I think he's in a great position now against a Ravens team that Le'Veon Bell struggled against earlier this year. And it's not surprising because they rank, top 5 in rushing DVOA. At one point they were first. I haven't checked the updated since Tuesday. So, but they're definitely in the top 5. And I think Le'Veon Bell is another tough day this week. So, by process of elimination, that means that Roethlisberger is going to have to do his thing. And with Jimmy Smith hurting, I think his number one target is going to be plenty active, and we know that Big Ben's big games usually correlate with some Antonio Brown. So I love Ben Roethlisberger this week.
Yeah, it's really interesting because that's the one thing about the secondary sites is when their main slate differs from the big ones. Talking about DraftKings and FanDuel, of course, having the main slate on Saturday, those guys always go low owned. And the thing is, you can play those main slates on every site. They have them available. Ricky, I'm with you. I love this Steelers offense. I actually like Le'Veon Bell a lot more than you do, just because of the fact the Ravens have allowed almost 700 yards through the air to running backs and 83 catches. So I think that's where he gets his value. But you're right. It's hard to run on this Ravens front seven, and Big Ben has to exploit something. Luckily, that Ravens secondary is just the matchup to do so. So, Jim, what about you? Who's your top quarterback this week? Who are you looking to build around at that position?
Well, I mean, at home, Roethlisberger's been awesome, right? I mean, he's been Breeze-like, but that's because the template's Breeze. I know that last time Breeze faced this Tampa team, it was kind of ugly, right? The offense obviously didn't show up. I'm actually looking. I'm not writing off that 2-week stretch, for Breeze, but I think it's obviously the outlier, kind of the aberrative performance for the whole season. I mean, he went into
the
aberrational, outlier.
Gotcha.
Okay.
I need my thesaurus.
There you go. Yeah, but the point is, it's an outlier. It's not the expected. I think the real Drew Brees showed up last week. He probably listened to some Eminem before he got out there. But he put up, almost 404 and just was incredible. And I think, the Vegas trend this week is 52 points at home favorites. The Tampa defense has been really solid. We saw last week, though, a home offense on a home fast track put up points against them. I think that's repeated again this week. The Saints averaged 56% more points at home than the average NFL offense. So, I mean, it's not a minor uptick to play in the Superdome. It's a sizable kind of slate shifting uptick. And we've been burnt before, going to the Detroit game down there and stuff like that. That was the highlight game of the week. But I just think Breeze has that 303 kind of, not floor, but kind of that expectation, that projection. So he's a guy that I'm trusting. I don't think in cash I'm going to have much Breeze. I think I established that this week with Ricky. I'll mention my cash guys in the next tier, but if you're going to pay up, I actually prefer him to Ryan, just because I think of how much production can get done on the ground with Atlanta. I just think Breeze. I don't think you need to oversell Breeze. It's Drew Brees at home in the Superdome against a familiar opponent. And if there's a narrative to play out here, I don't think he wants to look bad again. Against a team that just shut him down. Are you guys off Breeze because of the last game or what?
I really like him, especially like you mentioned at home. It's just it was a bit of a Freudian slip there when you said they averaged 56 more points. You meant percent, but honestly, I think I might believe you with points. 8 more touchdowns than any other team per game. But also, I just think the fact is that people will be looking at the previous game and thinking that this could be a situation where it's a bit of a trap. And looking at the pricing, he's $300 less than Brady. We know about his numbers without Gronkowski. $200 more than Ryan on DraftKings. And he's actually just $8,500 on FanDuel. And on FanDuel's main slate this week, you don't have Le'Veon Bell. You don't have that option. So you can afford to pay up more for Breeze. I have Breeze locked right now in my FanDuel cash lineup.
He's number one in RotoCurve rankings, right? He's the top RotoCurve quarterback. So
top quarterback. And by far, actually, when you look at it a relative perspective, there are 16 quarterbacks between 24 and 31 rating, and he's all the way up at 33. So it gives you a little bit of a disparity there. Now, I know you mentioned liking him, Jim, over Matt Ryan.
Yeah.
I like Matt Ryan too, but Ricky, you want to dive more into him?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at this matchup, this is the matchup that he went absolutely crazy earlier this year. Now, I know that there is a what have you done for me lately kind of thing, as in the Panthers defense has improved since that time. I think we can all agree on that. You know, for a short stretch, they were getting killed. They were 32nd because of this game in, DVOA against number one wide receivers. Now you look at them 25th. They're down to 78 yards per game. So they've kind of stabilized their production. They still don't have a corner who stands out, which makes me think that Julio Jones can have a big game once again. But I still think that, Matt Ryan against this team that's still not a great passing defense is definitely worthy of consideration. The problem is that Drew Brees is so similarly priced that I have a hard time, at least in cash games, playing him. But I think Matt Ryan is a great tournament option. And I think if you're using Matt Ryan, you got to use Julio Jones, because I think if one has a big game, it's probably going to be the other as well.
It's an excellent point. I saw earlier this morning, or last night rather, Delvin Breaux was shaken up as well, so that could just contribute even more so to the passing offense for the Atlanta Falcons. Now, another guy I wanted to talk about here is actually Blake Bortles, because I think a lot of people look at it like, oh, he's awful, and he is. There's no doubt about that. He hasn't proven to be an NFL quarterback. But luckily, this is fantasy. This is why I'm sitting here in a Santa hat talking about it. But it's fantasy football. And the thing is with this offense is they're going to throw, where the ball is going to go. And earlier this week in Ricky and Jim's videos, Jim touched on Nuke Hopkins as being an interesting option, and we'll talk more about him later. Or not Nuke Hopkins, Allen Robinson rather. So the situation with Robinson is, talk about all the time on RC Live, if you like a guy like him in the matchup, how about his quarterback who's near mid-price? So I just wanted to throw that out there. I think Bortles, given the savings you can get, you can spend up a receiver again like we did in the middle weeks of the season. Jim, what about you? What about some other quarterbacks for this week?
There's a guy named Aaron Rodgers that I like. I know the matchup doesn't appear ideal. Obviously, he's facing this Minnesota team. I mean, if we take last week's sample, which is a one-game sample, but, Andrew Luck moved the ball pretty capably against this Vikings defense. And the other thing, too, is that, it's a pressure-based defense. That's really where they get most of their value is pressuring the pocket. Rodgers is used to that. He's played in a kind of a dirty pocket most of his career. And he still put up 19, fantasy points, almost 20 fantasy points against the Vikings in week 2 when he was, under siege the entire game. And the other thing, too, is that's back when he didn't have any volume. The first 3 weeks of the season, Rodgers was throwing the ball 31 times a game, 28th in the league. Since that bye, and they've kind of shifted to this pass offense, he's got the 4th most attempts per game since week 5. So it's a volume-based offense, 39.9 passes a game, 40 passes a game ostensibly, and he leads the NFL in red zone attempts. He leads the NFL in red zone touchdowns. We talk about goal-to-goal attempts for running backs and kind of how that drives value. Well, this team doesn't, they had Ty Montgomery playing well, but they don't punch the ball in on the goal line, via the run. They either Rodgers will run it in more likely, or they'll pass it, to any one of his targets. And he's a star maker. I mean, Devontae Adams is having a breakout because of Aaron Rodgers, not vice versa. So, I know the home thing isn't great, but the Vegas trends aren't even that unfriendly, right? I mean, home favorites, a touchdown favorite pushes them to 25 implied points as a team. That's not that bad. I mean, that accounts for, 3 touchdowns and maybe even room for a 4th. I just like the setup. I think Vikings are kind of checked out to an extent, and field possession wise and time of possession wise, I just think I think the Packers could have the ball all day.
Yeah, you mentioned about Aaron Rodgers leading the NFL in red zone passing attempts. I have that up here in the RotoCurve red zone database. He has 100 passing attempts and 11 carries in the red zone for a quarterback. He has 26 passing touchdowns and 3 rushing touchdowns. The way I look at that alone is the volume he's leading the league and all of that. So that's a big thing to look at. But 1 in every 4 passing attempts inside the red zone resulting in a touchdown. Like you said, they're not feeding Montgomery as much as they should be inside the red zone, or at least the running game all year long. So I think that's an excellent trend to look for. And like you said, Minnesota has not been the same team. And like you said, they checked out because there isn't too much hope for them to make the playoffs. And they've had a lot of guys banged up on both sides of the ball. We saw how much they struggled without Harrison Smith. So one of those situations where I think the matchup may scare people initially, but diving deeper into it, it shouldn't scare you too much. Ricky, what about you? Any cheap quarterbacks this week?
Yeah, this one is one that's going to pain me over the next, 24 to 48 hours when I'm setting lineups because I'm looking at the weather report on Sunday in Chicago. Right now, 70% chance of precipitation. It looks like it's going to be rain. 41 degrees with the winds moving southeast at 20 miles an hour. So the setup is not great in terms of weather. But Matt Barkley still at the minimum after throwing for 300 yards and 3 touchdowns last week. I'll give you the specifics. In fact, 360, it was 362 and 2, excuse me. But what I liked about Barkley is he spread it around last week. I mean, 3 of the Bears receivers finished in the top 7 of fantasy points. How about that? That was a strange one to me. They basically got no tight end right now. They're working with Daniel Brown, who's just a nobody. So Alshon Jeffrey leading the charge, and I think that's part of what sparked this Bears offense. They've got a healthy Cam Meredith, and they've got Deontay Thompson as a guy who's kind of complimenting him right now. So now they're facing a Redskins defense that ranks in the bottom 6 of DVOA, and I'm looking at over the last month, the Redskins have allowed the 5th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks and the 4th most passing yards. So this Redskins defense has been getting beat, and what I really like about Alshon Jeffrey being back is he is going to, match up against Josh Norman and kind of take away some of the focus. So I think Barkley to Cam Meredith, and we'll get to wide receivers, but I think that's quietly going to be, a sneaky good matchup this week, assuming the weather holds. Now, if the weather doesn't hold, it's going to be one of those scenarios where you're going to kind of have to take a risk here. But at minimum price, the price pretty much alleviates all the risk. And if you're using him, you're kind of shooting for the stars. And I don't think you're doing it in cash games anyways.
Yeah, touching on Barkley real quick, we talked about before with Big Ben and how the ownerships fluctuate because of those different slates. If you do play that slate, I think even the people that would look towards that direction in price are going to look right at Blake Bortles and even forget about Barkley. So I wouldn't be surprised if Barkley's under 1% owned, and that's the difference you need. If he gets close to 20 fantasy points or more, which is very doable, we've seen him do that, at 1% owned at 5K, that's a big difference. And playing in that slate allows you to roster Le'Veon Bell and David Johnson if you wanted to do so. So it's a very interesting option there. I like that a lot. Now, Jim, there's another cheap quarterback that I think we have to talk about because Adam isn't here today. So you want to take Tyrod and run with it?
In honor of Pfeiffer, I'm going to get into some Tyrod Taylor action. For him, it's really just about the floor. It's so bankable, right? He had the opening game against Baltimore, which was a no-show essentially. Outside of that, his low point is 9.5 points on DraftKings against Cincinnati. If you watch that game, he ran in a touchdown that was called back on a pretty lame holding call, and Richie is incognito. Who I think that's who they called it on. But there was a holding call basically that came back in that game, and it really wasn't very legitimate. My point being that would have put him in that 15, 16 point tier that he's always at every week. So he's just so consistent, right? So we're talking about 13 or 12 out of 14 games where he's at least 15 fantasy points or 14.6, whatever it is. The floor is really high. There's only a few weeks this season where he hasn't rushed for 30 yards. I just think it's all there. He had 24 points against Buffalo earlier this year. And, this Buffalo pass rush, it's steady and it's been successful. But in some ways that actually promotes scrambling and promotes, him moving around the pocket. Sammy Watkins hasn't been good. It's just a rushing offense, right? It's the number 1 rushing offense in the league because of him, in the sense that they would be a good rushing offense without him. But we've seen this happen before with a rushing quarterback helps drive that value. I think that's what we have going on here. I just think he's 16 points in the bank, and anything above that is kind of gravy. And the price point remains, 5,400. You're paying, wide receiver 3 prices for, your starting quarterback, and you're getting cost certainty that tier doesn't offer. I mean, he's the same. Andy Dalton doesn't have a high floor. Carson Palmer doesn't have a high floor. These guys could tank you at that price. They could drag your price down completely. Even Barkley or Matt Moore, these guys could be they could be the reason you lose. I don't think Tyrod Taylor would be the reason you lost if you build around him in cash.
Yeah, exactly. That's the safety of picking that cheap quarterback, because you really just need 1 or 2 touchdowns and a few yards to be able to take you over the top. And the thing we know about Tyrod, as you said, 30 or more rushing yards in most of his games, it gives you that floor regardless. You're going to get 3. He's not going to throw for less than 150 yards. There's another 6. So 1 touchdown brings you at least to 12, regardless if it's on the ground and in the air. So anything more than that, like you said, he easily attains his floor of 16 points. Tyrod is 3rd, or actually tied for 2nd in rushing touchdowns in the red zone amongst quarterbacks. The only guy is behind Dak Prescott. How many times have we seen him line up with 5 wide and take that quarterback draw where there's nobody within 50 yards of him because of that offensive line? So I think Tyrod Taylor is an excellent option again in cash games. So let's just recap real quick in quarterbacks before we move on to the running back position. Ricky talked about Big Ben and Matt Barkley as 2 options to keep an eye on if you're playing that Sunday slate, and they will be very low owned, so it's definitely something to keep an eye on. He also mentioned Matt Ryan as well. Jim touched on Drew Brees, who is the RC-rated top quarterback of the week. He also mentioned Aaron Rodgers against a Minnesota team that is not as bad a matchup as you think. And we just touched on Tyrod Taylor, of course. So with that being said, let's move on to the running back position. It's interesting because of the way the slates split up. A lot of people in cash for weeks in a row have used David Johnson and Le'Veon Bell. For the main slates on most sites this week, you're going to have to pick. So, of course, that's up to the matchups, up to things of that nature. But as always on RC Live, we don't have to talk about those guys. We know that they're good plays. So let's dive into the plays that you may not be thinking about. Ricky, running backs. Let's start with you.
Well, first I want to say that, we do a lineup construction video, and I went into the Thursday night slate with neither of them. I used Beckham and Antonio Brown, and both of them, Beckham 18% owned, Antonio Brown 23%, because everyone's still on these backs. And I mean, even in cash games, I went that route. So I think that's the way to go this week. I mean, Johnson and Bell are just so insanely expensive, and neither of them draw great matchups that I think you can go with, a pretty balanced roster otherwise. And if you're going to do the balanced roster, let's start with the former Vice President Al Gore on his search for Man Bear Pig, the running back for the Indianapolis Colts. I mean, I think this is a great matchup for him this week. You're looking at a guy on DraftKings that's under $5,000 who's getting all kinds of volume. And, everyone looks at him like he's an old man with a cane, but this old man with a cane has gone over 15 fantasy points in 4 of his last 6 games. In fact, in 7 of his last 9 games, he's gone over 14 fantasy points. So this is a guy who's consistently produced. I mean, his carry totals 26, 10, 20, 15, 18, 19 in his last 6 games. So he's getting the work. This Oakland, rushing defense doesn't really scare me. I mean, Oakland, in terms of DVOA, I know they're middle of the road, but I'll get you the exact number. 21st in rushing defense, and then fantasy points allowed, they're right up there. They're inside the top 10. So this rushing defense really not that formidable, and the Colts are going to look to pound it. I mean, this is just so much volume for a guy who's just so reasonably priced that I think he's a guy I'm going to lock into all my cash game lineups. In fact, on Thursday I did.
Frank Gore has been a guy that everyone's been saying, you know what, this is the year he loses it. This is the year he goes downhill. I've been saying that since 2012. It's now almost 2017. The guy's had over 1,000 total yards in 6 straight years.
Coming off 100 yards last week against the Vikings
exactly.
at 39 to 40 years old, whatever he is.
Exactly. And the most impressive thing about him is he's played in every single game since 2011, which is very impressive for a guy of that nature playing that position. And like you said, Ricky, the volume is there. He's going to catch some passes out of the backfield. If not for Robert Turbin, he would have an additional 3 or 4 touchdowns in the last few weeks too. So one of those situations where the guy is just far too cheap. People are going to stay away from him because of the age. But in this situation, I'm not sure age is that much of a factor. Jim, what about you? If your running back positions this week, are you spending up for your top guy?
I am. I'm spending up more than Ricky is, at least in the Gore context. I mean, I do agree that you don't have to build around Johnson or Bell. The fade angles are price, and of course, the matchups aren't ideal either. So, you talk about checking boxes, like they don't exactly check the boxes for that premium pricing. I mean, obviously, in tournaments, I still think either one of them could be an absolute slate shifter. That's just the way they are. They're 200 total yard type guys, but to pivot from them, I think there's such a gap in pricing between them and DeMarco Murray. Over $1,000 in most cases. It's worthy to take the savings, and kind of like Aaron Rodgers, in the sense that the opportunity rates are just amazing, right? He leads the league in goal-to-goal touches per game with 2.3 per game. That's like multiple fastballs down the middle to a power hitter. It's such an opportunity for production. Put for some perspective, Le'Veon Bell averages 1.1 goal-to-goal touches per game, and the sample is pretty big at this point. David Johnson averages less than 2. So, 2.3 attempts per game, and it's consistent. He's getting a few each week. It's just such a high floor. He's 4th in the league in touches, 4th in the league in yards from scrimmage. The Titans ran all over the Jags in that disgusting color, that color game with like the mustard jerseys. But they had 214 rushing yards. That was a classic Blake Bortles garbage game, so I can see why you like him. He put up 30-some fantasy points without even really needing to do much. But yeah, I mean, I think 120 yards from scrimmage and a touchdown is the expectation. And for $7,000 on DraftKings and 8,400 on FanDuel, these are pretty affordable price points. Especially when the running back market's kind of getting out of whack.
Yeah, I'm with you on DeMarco this week. I'm not quite sure why he's priced at $7,000 on DraftKings, but somebody doesn't like him this week.
Do you think it's a reaction to Henry having the multi-touchdowns last week? Like, I don't see that.
It might be.
But if you watch that game, it wasn't like a seed change. It wasn't like that looked more like Robert Turbin. Not that what I mean by that is that it looked more like complimentary work where the guy got the touchdowns than it did like Mary losing any actual work.
Yeah, he's Gillislee. He's Mike Gillislee on another team right now.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, Murray is still the vast majority shareholder. And like Gillislee and like McCoy, there's going to be some games where he has 1 touchdown where he could have had 3. But we should focus on that 1 touchdown and the 120 total yards because that still drives value.
Yeah, exactly. I think the only guy that I like in that upper price range as much as I should, of course, like you mentioned, Le'Veon Bell, David Johnson are excellent options always. But LeSean McCoy at $9,000 for me against Miami is one of those top guys to use. But other than that, $2,000 less, and you're getting DeMarco Murray with the same
point. That's such a huge.
Share.
I mean, that's not one of these $500-$600 shifts.
Yeah,
you can apply that to wide receiver and completely change the complexion of your wide receiver. Core.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the $2,000 differences in wide receivers is the difference between Antonio Brown and Michael Thomas, which Michael Thomas is still a good option. We'll talk about it later, but it's an obvious upgrade when you're really looking at the gist. Now, Ricky, what about you? I know you mentioned that Frank Gore is kind of a guy you're building around. We talked about DeMarco. Are you using 2 mid-tier or cheaper running backs in your cash lineups?
So this is a guy that everyone's torn on. It's Todd Gurley, right? I mean, the guy just hasn't been good this year at all.
No, he hasn't.
I mean, if you are looking for what I mean, I don't use multipliers in football, but I know some people like to think analytically like that. So if you're looking for 3 times value from him, he has only done that once this year. So that is pretty ugly. I mean, 21 fantasy points against the Buccaneers all the way back. Wow, 9/25 was the date for that one. So besides that, it has been really ugly. I mean, his price dipped all the way to 4,500 last week. But this is the nuts in terms of matchup. I mean, every single person has been getting it done against them. So if Todd Gurley has any semblance of, talent left this season in such a downtrodden offense, I think this is the game. I mean, a few weeks ago against the Falcons, we thought that was, as close to the nuts matchup as it gets. And he went for 17.3 fantasy points. So it's not like he totally disappointed. And now, Devontae Freeman went for 139-3 against his defense. Bilal Powell 145-2. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. They've allowed the most rushing yards by almost 300. So I mean, this is a defense to get it done against. There's a 1-game sample with Gore. He was horrible, but it was the first game of the year. I think if there was ever a week for Gurley to look like the 2015 version of him, and I said that in the Falcons game, and he came close. I mean, he was over 3 times value in that one, to be fair. But his price has gone so far up that I think a lot of people are not going to use him. And I think that, at this point, it's pretty much backs against 49ers are automatic. I don't care if Gurley stinks. In fact, it's not him who stinks. It's the team. I don't care if the team stinks. I think he's able to get it done here, even for the inflated price. I still like him, but I know a lot of people are going to hate him.
Yeah, I'm on board with him. I think when you watch the games and you see the Niners defense, the way I look at running backs is it has to be a absolutely supreme talent to make that much of a difference. And we've seen this happen over the course of the last 20 years. Barry Sanders, of course, Adrian Peterson, seeing it with Ezekiel Elliott. But regardless, none of those guys, with the exception of Barry Sanders, but I'm not sure he was human, can really create without an offensive line.
None of us Sanders are, by the way. None of us are human.
See, Ricky tries, but I mean, it's weird. He's a Bears fan and has a Barry Sanders jersey, but that's a topic for another show. But yeah, the thing is with this watching the Todd Gurley is he's not struggling. I mean, we've seen a lot of the tape. We've seen some guys analyze the tape on Twitter, and he has no holes, none at all. So it's not his fault. And I think this defense for the 49ers is not going to be able to plug up any of the gaps. I expect those gaps to be open at least for 10 carries. And if he has 10 gaps to run through, you're going to get 65 yards and a touchdown. And that's kind of all you need when he gets a few catches in PPR format. So I really like Gurley this week. I think he has an excellent, excellent floor compared to what a lot of other people think. And I actually think he has the highest ceiling of any running back this week simply because of the Niners rush defense. One more bit of news before we move on to the other running backs. The Vikings just announced that Adrian Peterson is out. Also, their fullback, Zach Lyon, is out, and right guard, Brandon Fusco. So they are hurting this week. Stephon Diggs is questionable, as well as Harry Smith. So it could be a bloodbath in that game, and it kind of just contributes more to what Jim was saying earlier about Aaron Rodgers. So let's move on to another running back here. I know Ricky just mentioned Gurley, but Jim, what about the guy Ricky should like every week, and his Bears running back, Jordan Howard?
Yeah, I was going to make fun of Ricky for the Barry Sanders thing, but then I'm an Eagles fan with a Giants T-shirt on, so it doesn't work that well. I have a Lawrence Taylor shirt. So
well, hold on. Just for 1 second to sidetrack us. In the age of DFS, do jerseys and alliances even matter anymore? I mean, if a guy wins you $1 million and you're
did Barry Sanders win you $1 million?
No, but I'm just saying, like. Let's say if a guy has a good night for you, it doesn't even have to be $1 million.
Right.
Are you not allowed to be a fan? I mean, let's say you play $1 games and you win, first prize is $100 and you're a Bears fan and Aaron Rodgers does it. If you get an Aaron Rodgers jersey after that, I don't think, allegiances matter anymore. It's more about DFS.
If you're allegiance,
Ricky, why do you think I have an Eric Bledsoe jersey in the You remember that?
Exactly.
I have an Eric Bledsoe jersey for that reason. This is the third straight week I've worn a Tebow jersey.
I have a Willie Burton jersey for that reason. But no, that's an old reference. But no, I like Jordan Howard. Just the fact that he's a workhorse. I think he's 4th in rushing yards per game since he became a starter in week 3. He's averaging 2.2 yards before contact. Actually, after initial contact, and he's averaging, and the league average is 1.7. So he's 30% better than the league average in yak. The guy basically, he doesn't, like we just talked about needing a good offensive line or not. I mean, the Bears are better than the Rams, but he creates a lot of yards on his own, which is the point. He also has a receiving upside that Gurley maybe, really doesn't offer. This isn't a direct comparison to Gurley because I do like Gurley's upside. I mean, I think everybody with Jay Ajayi, only a handful of guys haven't really gone off against, the Niners when they've had the opportunity. But the thing is, the Redskins are a really sneaky good matchup for running backs themselves. I mean, second most rushing yards allowed in the NFC, only the Niners allowing more. They allow the second most yards before contact, which I really like because it, this late into the season, these samples are mature, right? I mean, we're in the end of the season, so we're not just quoting a 2 or 3 week sample. It's almost a full season where they've allowed 3 yards before contact per rush, which is amazing. Think about that. That means, running backs are getting to the second level past the line of scrimmage without even being touched against this team. Mason Foster, Will Compton seems doubtful, but these guys are 25th and 28th in run stop percentage on Pro Football Focus out of like 33 qualifiers. So they're just not very good interior linebackers in terms of run stopping. I think Compton has the 8th most missed tackles, and Foster has a bad missed tackle rate as well. So my point is that like not that dissimilar to DeMarco Murray, minus the red zone work, but meaning 20 touches, 120 total yards seems almost bankable for this guy. And at 6,300, you know, you can build a lineup. What's that? 13-3 between Murray and Howard, and get 45 touches out of your running backs. That's a pretty good buy.
Yeah, and the thing with Jordan Howard, too, is, of course, we know he didn't really become the feature back until about a quarter of the way through the season.
Yeah,
looking at the red zone stats here, he has 28 red zone carries, which is 5 less than LaShawn McCoy, Carlos Hyde, Le'Veon Bell. He's right there with Todd Gurley, Spencer Ware, Frank Gore. So you know he's getting the work, and it's been a shorter period of time for him because he was in the doghouse, quote unquote, whatever the Bears like to do to their running backs every year for the last 500 years. But the situation remains that Jordan Howard is the feature back now. He has a good matchup. He's going to get the touches, and he's been pretty efficient with them too. Now, Ricky, there's one more guy here that I have listed that we need to talk about. Is Spencer Ware just kind of falling off the face of the earth in terms of DFS ownership, or are you looking at him this week?
Yeah, he hasn't been great lately, but I'm working on this theory with the Denver team that kind of worked out for me last week and has been working recently, to be quite honest with you. Is the funnel theory is that, even guys like Tyreek Hill and their normal studs have an issue against these corners. I mean, this is a great group of corners. So teams have been pounding the ball against Denver. And I know they played in Denver a few weeks ago, and he only had 11.6 fantasy points, but he touched the ball 19 times, and now they're at home. So I think the way to beat this defense is to find creative ways to get it to their back. I know LeGarrette Blount scored last week for the Patriots. I think it's a similar setup with Spencer Ware against this team, and he's really cheap. I mean, 5,300. He's in that same tier as Frank Gore, Jonathan Stewart's a similar price. I mean, Jeremy Hill. So he's in like the RB3 pricing tier, and I think he's got upside far beyond that. If he's touching the ball, 20 plus times at home against Denver, I really like their chances, or his chances rather, because, he sees the ball in the passing game still a decent amount. And I think he's going to be really low owned. I think this is a tournament only play. But I think you're going to get him at 1 or 2%.
I'm with you on the ownership with Ware. I think a lot of people will look at last week and see, you know what? The Broncos stopped LeGarrette Blount. He only had 17 carries for 31 yards. He did score. Deion Lewis had 18 for 93 or 95. So it's not like they stopped the run.
Right.
They've given up touchdowns lately. They've given up rushing yards lately, as you said. And this is just a kind of a name reputation thing for the Broncos. You're not going to want to start guys against them because they're the Broncos. But as you said, they stop the quarterbacks and receivers at an elite level. Running backs have proven to be successful against them. So, yeah, at under 5% owned, Spencer Ware may be worth looking at because the volume is there. It's not like they're going to be throwing the ball 60 times. It's not like they're going to be giving Charkandrick West 12 carries or anything. So it's one of these situations that I think the volume can turn into production, and that's all we can ask for a guy at that price. Now, all right, Jim. Last week we talked about Kenneth Farrow, and he crushed all of us.
He did.
The thing is, that matchup wasn't elite. That changes a little bit this week, doesn't it?
Yeah, we're in a much different situation here, right? I mean, the Bears. I mean, the Bears. Sorry, Ricky. The Browns are the.
It's about the same. You can
they're the Niners of the. I mean, they're the Niners basically, the same team. I mean, outside of the Niners winning that one game, they've given up the second most yards in the league to running backs. They've given up a touchdown I'm looking it up now, on a ridiculous 31.2% of opposing drives. And the league average is 20.7%, in terms of opponent drives and how often do they score touchdowns. So a third of the time that an opponent gets the ball, they score a touchdown against the Browns, which is incredible. They're giving up a field goal value every time an opponent touches the ball. So factor in 7 possessions, 8 possessions for the Chargers, the potential for extended possessions. You always afforded extra possessions when you're facing Robert Griffin. The other thing, too, is the Chargers pass rush. There is a corollary here between, a ball hawking kind of I think that the Chargers, they lead the league now in turnover rate. They actually have a higher turnover rate than the Chiefs. They have the 5th highest pressure rate. Bosa is on pace for the most pressures in the last decade among rookie edge rushers. My point being, they could have the ball, an exorbitant amount of the game. They could just dominate possession. And I think, Ronnie Hillman's not going to get the ball a significant amount of time. It's really still going to be the Pharaoh show. This team still is going to have enough, I think, volume in terms of their offense to even if they trend pass heavy, to still get Pharaoh 17 touches, which is what he had last week. He played 75% of the snaps last week. Recency bias, I think, will drive down his value enough. He's still going to be a target because of the price and the matchup. I think the DFS crowd's smart enough to recognize this matchup, but it's one of these things where as your flex or as your RB2, this allows you, if you wanted to pay up for Le'Veon, if you wanted to pay up for David Johnson, or if you wanted to pay up for Shady, you could add him in, and it kind of, it brings it down to that $6,000 per back kind of range, which is what you're looking for. And you could still, obviously, allocate a lot of resources to the other skill positions. So I just think he's so bankable. I can't see how you get away from this guy in tournaments. I'm even interested in cash. I think, the 15 touches against this terrible, defense is enough.
Yeah, I agree with you. Ricky, do you have any thoughts on that? Because I know you like some other guys in that price range. Is Pharaoh still peaking for you?
Yeah, I mean, Pharaoh against this defense, I think, is a great spot for his ownership to basically get cut in half and the matchup to get, twice as good. So I think that this is a good spot. We were kind of talking about this earlier, is that, I think it's either going to be a week where they get to the goal line and Pharaoh scores twice, or Rivers ends up throwing for, 304 touchdowns. So I really think there's a wide array of outcomes for the San Diego offense, but most of them end in them scoring a lot of points, and we're just not sure how.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that's an excellent point you make too about kind of controlling the recency biases. You mentioned the ownership's going to be cut in half, but the matchup doubling. I love that quote because that happens a lot. And a lot of people will just completely fade because of that recency bias, because of the fact that maybe Pharaoh is the reason you didn't cash last week. But as he said, that ownership being cut in half and that matchup doubling and that ability, it's just one of those situations I don't think you can stay away from. So I'm with you guys. I think Pharaoh's a very interesting play this week, especially if you want to pay up your receivers. You can use a guy like him and Howard, or him and Gore, or even him and Gurley in tournaments, and have a high upside and the ability to spend up those spots. So let's recap running back real quick. We touched on DeMarco Murray and Jordan Howard as some higher tier players. In the middle tier, we liked guys like Spencer Ware, Todd Gurley, and Frank Gore was the cheapest guy we talked about, which I think is very interesting. He should be higher owned this week, especially with the floor he's had. And we also mentioned Kenneth Pharaoh. So moving on to receivers this week. Now, Jim, I'm going to tell you a quick story. When we talked before pre-show, doing the meetings, things of that nature, you mentioned that you wanted to talk about Antonio Brown. When I told Ricky this, he yelled at me. I think he basically flipped the table.
Go for it.
In the background, there was red all over his wall. To get more trophies, he threw all those on the ground. He was so upset that you picked Antonio Brown. So what I want to do right now is I want you to say everything you know about AB, and Ricky, you can't say anything.
No, I can actually give this to Ricky because I'll say this much: that Ricky, was right off the bat in our discussion earlier this week in our video series. He was all about Brown being kind of this is the get right week and kind of a week to build around him as opposed to Bell. Because I think each week when you evaluate the Steelers, and honestly just Bell and Brown are atop each market every week. It's almost you have to decide, is this a Bell or a Brown week? I mean, there's not a lot of ability to afford both, and really you wouldn't, unless you're doing some really unique stack in a tournament, you really don't want to afford both because you're going to have to go stars and scrubs purely. So I'll let you tell me I'll let Ricky explain why is Brown a foundation piece this week.
Look how happy he is.
Well, I'm just saying, I'm clicking the lock button with Antonio Brown this week. I'm not going to have a single lineup without him. That's how confident I feel in him.
Interesting.
Because, this only enhanced it. The fact that you look at that Thursday night slate and Antonio Brown 23% owned. I thought we were going to get like 50 or something like that. I thought people would be on this same trend where, Antonio Brown, his first game at home this season, 7.9 fantasy points. Since that time, 22.4, 22. This is DraftKings, by the way, 22.4, 22.8, 21.9, 37.4, 17.4. That was a 6 for 54 and 1 touchdown game against a tough Giants secondary. They're just a different offense at home. And with with Le'Veon Bell in a difficult matchup again, this funnel theory where if he's at all limited, maybe they line him up as a receiver more, and Ben just throws it a ton of times. And when he's throwing it, I mean, there was a stretch this year where 4 straight games, Antonio Brown 10 plus targets. I mean, it's been more rare that he hasn't been targeted 10 times than he has. So I just think Antonio Brown at home against a defense with Jimmy Smith hurting, that I think they're a little overrated in terms of secondary. I mean, I think Antonio Brown and Ben Roethlisberger are going nuts this week.
Yeah, I'm really upset that game not on the main slate because I would have used him all over the place in cash. I think it was – you guys hear that thunder? I don't know why that's happening in December, but, Delaware, right? So, yeah, I think this is one of these situations where Antonio Brown – I don't want to say the ceiling is 13 catches because I think that's one of these top 1% finishes. But like you said, if Roethlisberger is throwing the ball 50 times or more, 13 catches is well within reach. The yards are going to be there. He can score. It's just a very interesting situation. And I saw a stat earlier this morning that Odell Beckham has over 200 yards after the catch on touchdowns. Jordy Nelson and Antonio Brown have a combined 3 yards, I believe the stat was. So he's going to break one at some point. He hasn't done that yet. So that just adds more to the factor. And Jimmy Smith's banged up. The Ravens secondary isn't very good. All the stars aligned. Just the only thing that's sad for me is he's not on the main slate.
Yeah, that's why you play some of these secondary sites, to be fair, because I think a lot of people focus on their main sites and just try and transfer it over and don't do the additional research which could give you an edge if that's what you need in football.
Yeah, absolutely. And even when you want to play this all weekend slates and things of that nature on those big sites, people will still be shortcomings on still have shortcomings on their research as well. So, Jim, let's move on to you. I know you really wanted to talk about Antonio Brown, but we'll let Ricky get his way. Otherwise, he's just going to completely blow everything up. So, why don't you talk about your top guy other than Antonio Brown?
Well, I mean, it's ironic because you mentioned like that $2,000 gap and what you can do from say Brown to Michael Thomas. Well, that's a guy that I really admire this week in terms of value. Whenever he gets over 8 targets, he just goes off. He's a wide receiver 1, and I think Rich Rebar even put up a thing, in terms of how Breeze performs and how the team performs. Now, some of that is kind of like, I think, a fixed correlation in terms of, there's probably other factors involved in just directly passing to Thomas, that being the case. But a guy who really works particularly outside the whole time. He doesn't really work the slot. He's an outside receiver. That means he could get some Vernon Hargreaves action. Vernon Hargreaves has given up the most touchdowns, fantasy points, and receptions to receivers this season. So, I mean, talk about peppering a rookie corner. I think Breeze is well aware of that. I'm sure that's not like lost in the pregame analysis for this team. This team does well when Thomas does well. I just think the upside's pretty special. He kind of has that wide receiver 1. He has not Mike Evans upside, but he's been producing that kind of level in terms of he could put together 7 for 120 and a touchdown. We've seen multiple touchdown games from him as well. I think a stack with him and Breeze is really affordable, and I really don't see how you fade him, particularly when you consider the Hargreaves situation.
Yeah, I love Michael Thomas coming out of college. I love Michael Thomas beginning of the year, and I'm very glad that the Saints have kind of just kind of let the chains go on him, because a lot of times with rookies you see they start hot but they're still rookies. They have just let this guy play, and that he's done very well. It's one of these situations where, as Jim said, he has the upside of the wide receiver 1. It doesn't happen every week, but he can do it. If there's any week for it to happen, it would be this week against Hargreaves. It pains me to say it. I'm a huge Gators fan, a huge Hargreaves fan, but he has not been good this year. He will be a good corner. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
I think he will be too.
It's one of those situations where he's not there yet, and it's daily fantasy. So it's one of those situations you have to take advantage of. The guys he's around this week in RC rating for wide receivers: Antonio Brown, Julio Jones, Allen Robinson, which we'll talk about in a little bit, AJ Green. So he's up there with these top guys, and the price is over $2,000 less than the Julios and the ABs. Ricky, what about you? Wide receiver 2 or maybe even wide receiver 3, depending on how you want to build your lineups. What are you looking at?
Well, if you've got the extra money to spend, I really like T.Y. Hilton this week. I mean, this Oakland team, their outside corners have been outstanding this year. Sean Smith and David Amerson both grade very highly on Pro Football Focus overall and in terms of coverage. But the good thing about T.Y. Hilton is he lines up in the slot 56% of the time. I know Indianapolis doesn't have the world's biggest total this week. I think they were hovering around 24 points, if I'm not mistaken. But regardless, as I pull that up, I mean, T.Y. Hilton gets the matchup against T.J. Carey, which is the way to beat this passing defense. You don't want to throw at their outside corners, who looked awful earlier in the year, but they have straight up turned it around. Their total is 24.8, by the way. So I think T.Y. Hilton, who is their best receiver, also faces the worst corner, going out of the slot, especially if Moncrief is active, which we're not 100% sure about, but at least he can act as a decoy, open up some space for him if they get the running game going. And we know I like Frank Gore this week. I think Hilton, could have one of those sneaky 100-yard games just for the fact that, he's seeing a lot of targets because the other guys are being shut down.
I'm going to steal a page from Adam Pfeiffer's playbook here, talking about the Colts. They always go under own every single week, tournaments, every single week in cash, regardless. And it stems from not a lot of people using luck. And also stems from T.Y. Hilton's price. Brown, the same price as Antonio Brown, same price as Julio Jones. He's more than A.J. Green. He's more than guys in the middle tier that you maybe want to look at in the same level of talent. But the situation with T.Y. Hilton is he is a wide receiver one in fantasy. There's no disputing that. He gets the targets, he gets the catches, gets the yards. It seems like he scores a deep touchdown every other week as well. So it's one of those situations, like you said, Ricky, against Carey. And I didn't even like Emerson as much, but he has been playing better. The secondary for the Raiders is not very good, despite Reggie Nelson making the Pro Bowl, which I thought was very interesting. So it's a very good situation for the Colts as a whole. And that number one receiver is going to see a bulk of the targets, especially if Moncrief is out. So I'm with you on that. I think it's an excellent play. Now, Jim, you mentioned Antonio Brown. You mentioned Michael Thomas. I can't wait to hear you live discuss Nuke Hopkins because I love this guy this week. Before I watched the videos earlier this week, you guys, between you two, I loved him even more after watching it. Now, as time goes on, I just literally woke up this morning waiting to hear you talk about DeAndre Hopkins.
That's interesting that you're waking up thinking about me, but
and we know what happens.
Take it as you want. It's out there.
Hold on. We know a natural function of the human body, especially males, when they wake up too. So that's just a thing thrown in there that we have to know about.
People from Ricky's gonna get booted from.
I wake up thinking about Ricky I wake up thinking about Ricky in a Barry Sanders jersey. But
this escalated far too quickly tonight.
No, seriously. I just think the price point is incredible, right? I mean, but it's reflective of how bad this season's been for him. But I think it's kind of obvious just last week. I know it's only that one game sample or even a 3-quarter sample. Look, Blake Bortles threw one. Blake Bortles, same thing, right? But Brock Osweiler threw one pass to Hopkins last week, and it was a pick, and it was an interception. Was it a pick six even? It was an interception though. But Osweiler has been terrible this year. He's last in the league in yards per dropback, 5.25 yards per dropback, which is just incredible. I think Fitzpatrick's the only player with a worse passer rating among qualified quarterbacks. So it's pretty obvious you're not talking about a league replacement level guy. You're talking about a below replacement level quarterback with Osweiler. Well, there's not a lot of evidence that Savage is league average, but last week he passed the ball capably downfield. He completed, 45% of his passes past 10 yards, which is kind of a league average kind of thing. Osweiler is like Blake Bortles in that 20-25% range on those passes 10 yards down the field. You can't move the ball that way. Teams will never play you honestly. So I just think there's the ability for volume to come back in. And last year, what was the template for Hopkins? It was 14 targets from a league average quarterback or below, a replacement level quarterback. And, even Brian Mallett, these guys, as long as you can get the ball capably to the guy and you're willing to throw it to him, you can get it done. Osweiler couldn't do that. Savage can, 8 of 14 targets completed, tied to second most receptions of the year. Cincinnati, they're solid enough in coverage, but they've also been beaten up before. Jones has been exploited before. You're talking about a corner near the end of his career. They're 21st in pass coverage on Pro Football Focus. There's just a lot to like here. The floor is incredibly high, and the ceiling's actually high too. We could have one of these, Hopkins blow-up games, and it could happen at a time when redraft investors would be really salty because he had a terrible year for them. But who cares about them right now? It's daily fantasy, and this is a perfect week to have him as your wide receiver 3.
Yeah, I love DeAndre Hopkins this week, along with another guy that I think could savor the entire year, and Allen Robinson. We'll talk about him in a few seconds. But the way I look at DeAndre Hopkins is, how far have we come in the NFL season that Tom Savage is going to be tenfold of an upgrade from the previous quarterback? I mean, Savage was a guy that got drafted and everyone scoffed at it. He did look good last week, I'll give him that, but that just shows you how bad that offense has been, how bad Brock Osweiler has been, and how excited we are that Tom Savage is the starting quarterback for DeAndre Hopkins. But with that being said, I do think it is a good play. I'm going to have quite a few of Hopkins myself this week. But before Ricky talks about his other receivers, Allen Robinson is $4,600. Now, I didn't think that was ever going to happen this season. Now, I especially didn't think it was going to happen against the Tennessee Titans. But in Week 16, this is the week that it has to happen, right? I mean, if there's any other week it's going to happen, it would be against how horrible this Tennessee secondary is. They can't cover anyone. If they go up big, Robinson's going to see the targets. The way I look at it now, his price is so low where if he gets 3 catches for 40 yards, it's not going to absolutely destroy you. Now, that being said, I wouldn't use him in cash games at all because of that situation. So it definitely wouldn't be the best thing in tournaments. But at his price, it's not like he's going to be a complete dagger if he does lay an egg. So I definitely want to have him with Blake Bortles because the two of them combined, $9,600, which is around the same price as Le'Veon Bell and David Johnson. And the ceiling is there for at least 40 points. All right, so Ricky, why don't you take it away here? A guy that I've liked a lot lately is Golden Tate because of the Theo Riddick injuries. Are you using him if Riddick is out only, or you just like him regardless?
No, I like him better with the.
I think Ricky's mic just went ghost, or maybe his voice box stopped.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
I can.
Yeah, we're good.
Right,
I liked it better with the mic on mute.
It was kind of cool. It was kind of cool.
There we go. That was strange. I like him with Riddick out much better. Let's put it that way. I don't think I'm going to use him anywhere if Riddick in fact plays, but it's not looking good. I mean, he hadn't practiced through Thursday at the very least. So if they're going with Dwayne Washington at running back, that means they're gonna have to throw the ball more than usual. And whenever they do that, I mean, obviously all the wide receivers are going to benefit. I think you got to like Anquan Bolden as a punt in tournaments, but I think Tate then has this cash floor and tournament upside. I mean, you look at the last 3 weeks, 10, 11, and 13 targets, 8 for 145 and 1, 6 for 58 was his worst performance, and 8 for 122. So this is a guy seeing a ton of volume at kind of a mid-tier price. So if Riddick's out again, that just means that 10 targets are basically solidified. So I don't know how you overlook Golden Tate in that situation. And then Cam Meredith is a guy that I really like this week. I mean, Josh Norman on Alshon Jeffrey, I would assume, they're going to try and shadow him because he's the team's most, at least, talented receiver, which means that Cam Meredith is going to see more targets than usual. And even before, Jeffrey returned, Meredith had a big game a few weeks ago where he scored a touchdown. Then again, I mentioned that 3 Bears receivers were in the top 7 in fantasy points last week, so pretty much everyone had a good week. But this week sets up for Meredith to have the big week again. Him and Deontay Thompson both viable in tournaments, but I think Meredith is actually a cash play because against a bad, secondary in this Redskins that I mentioned have been struggling lately, he's going to see a lot of volume. I think he sees 10 targets in this one at 9,200 on Fantasy Draft, which means he's in the 4,000s on DraftKings. That's just a ton of volume. If you need a third receiver to fill out your cash team, I wouldn't go much lower than him just because he's so safe.
Yeah, I definitely like him a lot this week because, like you said, all the boxes seem to check out because there really isn't that many other options for the Bears team, considering Alshon should be, and we hope he is, shadowed by Josh Norman. One other guy I want to mention in the same tier as Golden Tate is Julian Edelman this week. I think he's gone a little bit under the radar, especially for cash games, because a lot of people with Gronk out, they're trying to stay away from that Patriots offense other than maybe the running backs. But the last 6 or 5 games, Julian Edelman has 6 or more catches in each game. He has 6, 7, and then 3 games of 8. Listen to his targets, 12, 15, 12, 11, and 17. So quick math, that brings you up to 40, 57, 67 targets in 5 games. that's a guy I want to have in cash games. His price is not that expensive, and I do think you can afford to play him with a more expensive receiver with paying down at running back this week. I want to have him against a Jets secondary that can be exploited. I think a situation where 8 or more catches and 100 or more yards is very, very reasonable for an expectation for him, and that's perfect for cash games. So that's a way that I do want to migrate towards if I have the money to spend up for him. Recapping receivers before we move on to tight end. Ricky mentioned Antonio Brown. Jim loves Antonio Brown. I love Antonio Brown. Everybody loves Antonio Brown, but he is on that different slate, so he is lower owned. We mentioned T.Y. Hilton and Michael Thomas as kind of the upper mid-tier receivers, and Michael Thomas's price is in the wide receiver 2 or 3 range, so it's something to definitely consider. We touched on Golden Tate and Julian Edelman as cash game plays in the upper 6,000s on DraftKings. And, of course, the cheaper guys, Cam Meredith in cash games and in tournaments. We also mentioned DeAndre Hopkins and Allen Robinson, hopefully seeing a revival week before week 17. All right, so tight ends, guys. I don't like doing this every week because tight ends has just been so bad lately. It's been a situation where Gronk doesn't play, Reed hasn't played, Greg Olsen has been decent, but he's been on some different slates. Eifert has gone down in terms of usage and success. So
and he's ruled out this week. I think they just ruled him out.
Yeah, so there you go. It's not a fun position to talk about. So, guys, give me 2 guys that you're going to try to fit in. But if I could just ban this position, I would. Start with you, Ricky.
All right, I'll start it again. I really hate this position this week. I think Jim's probably going to mention the guy that I will be inevitably using. But, if you need to pivot anywhere to fit other things, I think this is the position. And one of the guys that I like is Jermaine Gresham at minimum, just because then you could just spend up elsewhere and say, screw it. I mean, this is a guy who's been pretty consistent over the last 3 to 4 weeks. And you look at this Seattle defense, 17th in DVOA, 46.1 yards per game. But really the allure of using Gresham is the fact that, a lot of the other guys draw difficult matchups. Obviously, Sherman in this tough secondary. I mean, David Johnson, a tough matchup against the Seahawks defense. And you look at the targets for Gresham, 10, 6, 7, 5 during the course of his last 5 games, over double-digit fantasy points 3 times, and one of them was a 9.5 fantasy point. So you're just getting, a decent level of consistency for minimum price, enough to move the chains where Gresham shouldn't kill a cash lineup, and that's really the selling point for him. And the other one I like is Antonio Gates against this Cleveland defense that's allowed the most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. I think he's 2 touchdowns away from setting the record for touchdowns for a tight end. At the position. So they definitely want to find a way to get him into the end zone. I mean, Hunter Henry's been the guy scoring lately, but I still think that this means something to the team. And he does lead all, at least heading into last week, led all players at the position in terms of red zone targets, and 5 touchdowns was, I think, 5th. So he's still up there in terms of, them looking for him where it counts. Now, if he doesn't score a touchdown, he might flop, of course. I mean, that's kind of how it is with this old man at this point, but you look back, I mean, he's still got 9 targets a few weeks ago, so he's still got at least a little something left, and with nothing left at this position, really, I mean, I think both Gates and Henry are viable, and it's going to be the one who scores a touchdown who ends up, coming through for owners.
And the position is tough. That's kind of why I like Gresham, because he's going to give you between 6 and 8, maybe 10. And it's not going to crush you at his price point. But like you said, if anybody's going to have that week, it could be Antonio Gates. Now, Jim, what do you think? You like any other tight ends here?
I do like the narrative of Gates just because he's 2 away from the tying the all-time record. This might be his last year. So I think it's a narrative thing. But if you're up, and it's not even a narrative thing, what it is actually on the sidelines, if they're prepping, between downs, or if they're in the huddle, they could call in a play and say, get it to Antonio. That's we talk about this narrative stuff, but it can come down to just saying, get it to the guy who's chasing a record. But I like what did Lenny Walker, enough. I mean, and obviously he's chalky in the sense that, like Josh was saying, there's just destruction around the market, right? Eifert's out of the picture. Graham doesn't have a great matchup because the Cardinals have been good against tight ends. It's just there's not a lot going on here with the high end of the market outside of maybe Olsen. So he had 4 for 75 last time against the Titans, against the Jags rather. The Jags personnel wise, Cyprian, Posluszny. You can get these guys in space and exploit them over the middle. And that's where Mariota does the majority of his damage, is between the painted numbers. So I just think personnel-wise, you don't need to oversell Walker. He's an established commodity. He's only 4,300 on DraftKings. I think that's really where I'm targeting him. I'd probably pay down on FanDuel where he's 6,400, and maybe even pivot down to this guy, Cameron Brate, tied with Hunter Henry for the league in touchdowns. This hasn't been a great touchdown year for tight ends. Obviously, we're this late in the season, and 7 touchdowns takes the lead. Last year was a double-digit year across the board for several guys. Since week 3 is really when they integrated him after they cut Safarian Jenkins, and once they committed to him as their lead tight end. He's got 27.3% of the red zone targets for the Bucs. That leads. That's more than Mike Evans. He's second in total targets behind only Evans over that period. And he's had, I think, 5 targets in 7 of the past 8 games. So you talked about Gresham's floor. I think Brate has that floor as well. Obviously, the price point is higher, but, in the Superdome, the second best target on an offense that's going to have an applied total around 24, 25 points on the road, it seems like a good spot against, a New Orleans defense that has Von Bell out there, guys that, practice squad level safeties out there, replacing, Kenny Vaccaro.
Yeah, the tight end position definitely is something that has been disappointing this year, but you can spend down at most spots and give yourself more cap space to spend up at others. Let's recap real quick some injury news before we move on to our bold calls. Dante Moncrief will play. Adrian Peterson is out. As we mentioned before with the Vikings news, Tyler Eifert is not going to play this week. A.J. Green looks like he's good to go. And one more thing for you, Ricky, Theo Riddick did not practice again today. So we could see another Golden Tate week and Matt Stafford throwing the ball short all the way across the field. So I think Golden Tate definitely would get a bump if Riddick is indeed confirmed out.
Yeah, I'm in for that.
All right, bold calls, my favorite part of RC Live, any sport that we do. I want to start with Jim because he has a few things written down here.
Yeah, well, I already talked about Kenneth Farrow. I would follow the Pharaoh to the promised land this week. I think it's 120. Ricky likes that because anything that involves a pun, he's down with. But 125 yards from scrimmage and a touchdown is my expectation. And then I'll steal another one from Ricky. I think Cam Meredith has 100 yards and a touchdown. I think the Jeffrey thing kind of throws people off the pattern. He had 13 targets last week. He's got 9 red zone targets over the last 3 weeks. So that's up there with I think he's 6th or 7th in the league in red zone targets. So yeah, Barkley's going to throw the ball a ton. This game kind of screams, I know the wind and all that stuff, but that didn't affect the shootout last week, right? I think we overplay weather sometimes. But yeah, either way, those are my 2 guys, and both of those guys are highly affordable. So my 2 guys are Meredith and Farrow to each top 100 yards and a touchdown.
I want to mention my bold call here before Ricky's because I think his is very interesting. What I'm going to go with here, I'm going to say Todd Gurley wins somebody $1 million this weekend. I think he has a situation where he could rush for 150, not 1, not 2, but 3 touchdowns. I'm looking at 150 yards and 3 touchdowns out of Todd Gurley for 36 DraftKings points and around 32 on the FanDuel. I think this is a situation where it's just perfect. It finally comes together. And I still believe the talent level is there with Gurley. It's just his offensive line. But when they're trying to block a team that is clueless on how to fill gaps, it could turn into a great week for the Rams running back. So, Ricky, what about you? What's your bold call?
Well, I'm looking at this slate on DraftKings, this 15-game slate that supposedly no one plays. And we've got 2 contests with $100,000 to first, if I'm seeing that right. Hold on. Let's see here. Single entry. There's plenty of prize pool. Let's put it that way. I think this slate is worth playing, this Saturday slate, and it's available on Fantasy Draft as their main slate this week to play Ben Roethlisberger because I think he breaks out for 304 touchdowns. I think he matches Drew Brees in terms of fantasy points for a lot less. And I think that, having seen the ownership percentages from Thursday, Brees is the chalk. But I think Roethlisberger has a throwback 30-plus fantasy point day to where everyone's like, why wasn't I thinking about him? And you'll be the smart one, being on the right side of that play.
Now, my question for you is, Ricky, do you think he's going to have 304 touchdowns or 304 touchdowns?
304 touchdowns. I don't see, this defense stopping him whatsoever. I think they're going to be 3-second possessions for the Ravens. Ben will get it back, and it's going to be like Madden on easy, just a bomb to Antonio Brown. I would love to see that.
300. All right, so you're saying I like it. Okay, so stack all of the Steelers. He's going to have 304 touchdowns. So you move him with Kenneth Farrow, and he can take you to the promised land. I'm not quite sure Ricky knew that was a pun right away, because that is one of the best ones I've ever heard. It calls a chuckle for me. I think Todd Gurley is going to take me to the promised land. So real quick, let's recap what we have. Everything up on RotoCurve.com. Tools and cheat sheets for every position: quarterback, receiver, and of course running backs and tight end. You can see all of them aggregated into a big cheat sheet, which also has our RC rating per dollar for a good way to find the top plays on the slate. We also have a new NFL lineup builder. It's an excellent tool you can use to use the RC ratings and projections to make your favorite lineups for the upcoming week in NFL DFS. All the stats you heard us mention with red zone information, all that's up on the site. Snaps, target rate, touch rate, all sorts of information you can use to help you make lineups in NFL DFS. We also have DFS Pro Brian Healy has a cheat sheet up each and every week. He has been to live finals the last few weeks, so I'm sure he's glad to be home again to play NFL DFS on this holiday weekend. Adam Pfeiffer couldn't be with us today because he currently sounds like Gollum from Lord of the Rings if you haven't heard him talk. Adam Pfeiffer's cash picks are up, all 4 million words, the most in-depth article I've read each and every week. He will give you all of his picks at each position. That is up on the site as well. Ricky and Jim have 4 videos that I love watching each and every week. They have done this before this week, and they kind of touched on everything today. But what they did this week, a little bit different, they touched on lineup construction. And I think you guys should give that a thought, because there are 2 very good DFS players you have on the other side of the table from me that are very ingrained in how to play this game and how to play the sport. So it's something you definitely should keep an eye on, because lineup construction, I think, is the hardest hurdle for DFS players to get over. All this content for under $1 a day. There is not a better bargain in DFS. One more promo we have on RotoCurve. If you haven't seen it yet, head over to the site. You'll see a banner. You can click to win 2 tickets and a full package to the big game in Houston. Be sure to give that a thought. It includes lower level tickets. It includes a tailgate. There's events down there with all sorts of NFL players and celebrities. Give it a shot. All you need to do is go to the site, sign up, and we will let you know when you can attend that contest for the big game. For Ricky Sanders and Jim McCormick, this has been RotoCurve Live for Week 16. I'm Josh Collacchi. Good luck, everyone.
Peace.